Richard Fontaine, CEO of CNAS, discusses what it's like to run a think tank. We get into Biden and Asia and how the new president's foreign policy team will prioritize what they want to get out of the U.S.-China relationship. We also get into Richard's biggest argument with current DoD official and former CNAS Vice President Ely Ratner, what he's learned from looking at China questions with Silicon Valley luminaries, why he'd like to do more faith-centered studies of foreign policy, what fiction he's reading, and if you stick around until the end of the show, we get into export controls. Richard Fontaine, welcome to China Talk.
Thank you for having me.
So, full disclosure, I am a adjunct fellow at CNAS. Richard, so what is it like to be the CEO of a think tank when it seems like half of your stable of scholars have left to join the administration? Are the Zooms feeling empty? Do you feel like you're left behind after the rapture? Or is it more like a mother duckling happy that the chickens are off to roost type vibe?
I wish I could come up with a really good on-the-spot analogy that would outdo those. But we have had several folks go into policy jobs and significant positions of responsibility in the administration. I've gotten emails from folks that say, "Oh, you must be lonely." But in fact, 4 of our full-time people have left, which leaves 35 full-time people still on the job, plus our more than 60 adjunct fellows and visiting fellows and things like that. So there's still a lot of folks at CNAS, but we are, very proud of those who have gone in, and a couple went in from our board as well, including Kirk Campbell, the chairman of our board, and Avril Haines is on our board. So we've had some good people from our full-time staff, our board, alumni, and others go in, but we still have well more than a critical mass still doing good work.
So what has it like been managing a think tank through a pandemic? Is there anything, particular to think tank work that, this remote world of the past year and change has brought upon that you'd like to reflect on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that has changed the way we do our work. Some has made things better. The kind of conversations that, of course, I guess were theoretically possible, we just never really did them as much before everybody started doing things virtually, are now routine, where we'll have someone in Japan talking to someone in Germany, talking to someone in New York, to someone in DC, to someone in California, without having to fly people around and all these other kinds of things, which gives a certain richness to the policy and other discussions that we value. We've also been able to do a number of virtual events and do some creative things where we've had audience input and polling and collected sort of input and data and things like that in ways that we hadn't done it before. I think the harder thing is, well, one, if you're going to be at a international affairs think tank, but you are unable to travel internationally, then that's going to limit to some degree the kind of insights that you can gather. And then also a place like CNAS is highly collaborative. We spend a lot of time just bouncing ideas around, testing those ideas, trying to generate new ones and things. And that is hard, or harder anyway, when you're in a virtual environment. But on the whole, the key for us has been not just to treat this as a slightly different version of the physical existence we have, but actually rethink the kinds of work we're doing, the policy effect that the pandemic is having, and then how do we actually solicit and deliver ideas in this virtual way differently than we did before.
So going more broadly from just the pandemic stuff, where do you think CNAS is firing on all cylinders, and what are you trying to focus to improve the organization on?
Yeah, so I think that, CNAS has been very much at the center of the most important national security policy debates really since its inception, including over the past few years. But I think right now is going to be a especially golden time for CNAS. One, where we have a number of folks who have been sort of at CNAS or in the orbit in positions of policymaking responsibility and a lot of connectivity with policymakers, but also an era where we have a very closely divided Congress, where the bipartisan nature of CNAS enables us to connect ably with Republicans and Democrats and try to come up with policy solutions that can attract the support of people in both parties and both in the Congress and in the executive branch. We put a lot of emphasis on what the United States should look like in a world of heightened competition. We sort of think of sharper as one of the ways through which we see where we need to go. And you can apply that on the military side, on the economic side, on the technology side, and certainly with respect to our three regional programs in Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And thinking about things that way gives kind of an overall coherence to the work that everybody's doing that should stand on its own when they're taking on individual problems or issues, but ultimately add up to this overarching question is, where should the United States be going? How should we sort of configure ourselves for a competitive world where we clearly have issues at home and abroad? What does that look like over the next few years? So that's where I think we can be right at the center of the debate.
What do you think CNAS has to improve on?
Well, there's a few things there too. One is we have some folks to hire with the departures. So we are in the middle of hiring processes for a few of our key roles. So we have that to do. Two, as I alluded to before, it is challenging to get the richness of the ideas bouncing around when you can't physically be in the same place all day long. And so, that's going to be a challenge until the pandemic kicks back in to a more normal state of affairs, God willing. So, there's that. And then we can always do a better job on the audience. We always have to make some choices. We're not a grassroots organization. We've gotten outside the beltway over the past few years in a number of different ways I could go into. But you always end up having to make choices. Is the primary audience going to be the DC policymaking class? Is it going to be broader than that? Is it going to include the private sector in California? What about New York and things like that? And you end up having to make choices. And generally, the broader, the better. But it's something that we're kind of always rethinking about, what are our primary audiences? How do we touch them most effectively? How do we convey our ideas? And how do we get ideas from them so that we're not, sort of a prisoner of Beltway think or East Coast think or whatever.
Yeah. So you mentioned hiring and you mentioned CNAS as a bipartisan organization, and you've written poignantly about your experience watching the Capitol riots as someone who has spent years working on the Hill. In that context, as an early never Trumper and having watched the presidency run this course, how are you thinking about hiring former Trump folks?
I think everything turns on what they did when they were in government. I am not one of the folks who thinks that after Donald Trump was elected that we should not have had a government or that we should not have had people join that government. I encouraged good people to go in and to do their best under what sometimes were very difficult circumstances. And I continue to think that was the right course. I personally opposed Donald Trump early and often, shall we say, all the way back from early 2016 through today. And I think those of us who opposed his candidacy and his presidency were vindicated. But, a lot of this was about America and about the government that we were going to have and about the competence of the people we have in there. And so I think there were people who were good people trying to do the right thing under difficult circumstances. And there were people who were not great people, not trying to always do the right thing. And I think distinguishing between the two is sort of all important.
So let's talk a little bit about think tank size. So CNAS's budget is like 10 to 15 million. CSIS clocks in at around 50, CFR 80, and Brookings, which also does domestics too, so it doesn't entirely apples to apples, is $100 million a year. Given the relative size of CNAS, how do you think about which spots to pick and topics to hire for and orient the organization around?
That is, in some ways, the most important question that we think about every day, or at least every week, because, our current budget's $11 million. We generally have about 40 full-time people, a lot of, a group of adjuncts, fellows who are fantastic, and some visiting fellows and interns and things like that. But as you pointed out, that's significantly smaller than a number of our friends who are in other organizations and so forth. So what you decide not to do is just as important as what you decide to do. You can't do everything. So we ask ourselves several questions before we're going to embark on a new project, a new research area, whether we're going to continue a new research area. All of these kinds of things are subject to a few questions. One is this issue truly important? Is the question we're trying to answer, figure out, is it truly important to the country at this time? Or is it just one of these questions that's kind of always out there and lots of different places have something to say on them? The second is, can we uniquely tackle this in a way that's either it's not being handled by someone else, or we think we can do it better, or we have some special insight and people in it with the experience and the knowledge, or some special way of dealing with this. So what's going to be kind of the comparative advantage in tackling this question as opposed to any other ones? And then what do we think we can do with that? So, it's of no one's interest to take on important, difficult, hard questions where we have some special capability in answering them, and then to just see that end up as a glossy document as opposed to something that we can try to inject into the policymaking discussion. And so when you start to ask tough questions about those, it tends to narrow things down to a much smaller group of issues where you really think you have the potential to move the needle.
The funding for CNAS, it's 15% from the government and 85% from corporations. And, as nice as it is to think that, like, okay, we want to research this thing, let's do it, the lights still have to be kept on. So, Richard, maybe just talk about, like, I don't know exactly what the question is here, but the relationship between the topics you guys choose and then what you're able to get funding around, and sort of the, how those two things interact with each other.
Yeah, so just to correct your percentages a little bit. So we've got 4 general areas or sources of funding. Corporations tend to be about 55-60% in any given year. Government tends to be somewhere between 15-20%, sometimes a little bit lower than that. Individuals has grown, and foundations as well. Foundations really sort of fluctuate, but altogether, those are the sources that make up the revenue picture at CNAS. There's kind of 2 ways to fund work that I've seen in the world of think tanks. One is to see where funding is available, and then to go out and try to seek it and do the work attached to it. That's not particularly fun. The other is to develop a research agenda and a set of questions that we think are important wholly apart from funding, and then to go out and try to attract the funding for it. And so that's generally what we try to do. One's not always successful in doing that, because sometimes there are issues that not an individual nor a foundation nor a corporation nor a government entity is particularly interested in supporting the work behind. But that's the general approach, is to sketch out what we think is an important research agenda, and then go out and see if we can attract the funding to support it.
So let's say you stumble across a 5-year, $20 million, or let's give you 10 years, a 10-year annual $20 million annuity. What would you be, what topics would you be going into? What would you be trying to hire for? What would you think about doing with the money, investing it back into CNAS?
I would give it some thought. I don't think I would be very responsible if I just said, okay, here's how I'd go spend that money. I got the question for you right now. I mean, and again, to get back, I guess, a little bit to some of the questions that I would ask, goes to, well, is it over 5 years or 10 years? Who are the kind of people that we could be able to bring aboard to do what? I don't have a stock. If only I had $5 million, I would do X, Y, and Z, because, there's a lot of possibilities that depend. And in addition to that, one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to think tanks is to be nimble. So, if we sort of mentally put our heads back 10 years ago in 2011, and said, what are the big issues facing the country on a national security agenda? A lot of people would have said, well, it's counterinsurgency, it's terrorism, it's the wars in the greater Middle East, things like that. Increasingly, you would have had people said Russia and China. You probably would have had very few people saying, domestic terrorism, or our own sort of the poverty of our own democratic practice, or interference in elections, and things like that. So it's hard to project that far out, and part of the way to be relevant and make sure that one is focusing on the most important issues where you have a comparative advantage is to be kind of constantly active in this art of recreating what you're doing and how you're doing it and what you're focused on. So that's probably a long winded way of saying I don't have a pat answer to your good question.
Well, my next one was, what if you get $100 million each year? But I guess we can skip that. I think you sort of got towards the central contradiction that I was aiming at, is like, it's good to skate towards the hockey puck, but if you skate too far, no one's going to pay you for it.
Well, so even aside from the funding, what you want to, if you as a think tank, the currency is policy relevance, right? And so if you take on something that is relevant today, but is not going to be very relevant by the time you complete your work in 7 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years, then you've missed it. Or if you have something that's going to be relevant but not for 5 or 10 years, then you've missed it, right? So it's to think not only what's important today, but what's going to be important by the time you'll have completed your work on whatever the questions are and been able to actually generate and then inject those ideas. And that's sort of the sweet spot that you have to think ahead. So you want to mix metaphors, I guess. You want to skate to the hockey puck that's going to be a year or 2 years out, not the hockey puck that's you've got right now, or the hockey puck where it's going to be in 10 years.
So speaking of things that are relevant today, Asia policy. Richard, when you look at Biden's Asia team and, the foreign policy team more generally, there aren't many flyers like, say, a Samantha Power was in 2008, or a Mike McFaul, or a, China tech-focused CNAS adjunct and podcaster. Pretty much everyone, it seems, has spent a significant time either working in the Obama administration or in a DC think tank. And, there was this recent Wall Street Journal headline saying that China's policy will be run by a team of rivals, but it seems more to me like it's an old group of colleagues getting the game back together. Do you think there's anything that the folks in government now should be wary of, given how much familiarity they all have with each other?
Yeah, I do. First of all, I don't. I guess it depends on what team you're talking about. If you're looking at the cabinet level, it's different. But if you're looking at the folks who are going to be managing Asia policy on a daily basis. So Kirk Campbell at the White House, and Ely Ratner at the Pentagon, and the other folks who are going to be at the NSC and at State and so forth. It doesn't look like a team of rivals to me. People certainly have different perspectives, but they all know each other, have worked together well, and I think can work ably together as a team. I think part of the challenge now that there's a coordinator for this for Indo-Pacific in the White House is going to be where the primary diplomatic outlet for engagement with the Asia Pacific is. Is it going to be, as it usually is, in the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia Pacific? Or is it going to be at the White House, or is it going to be some mixture thereof? Or is it going to just kind of organically spring? And I would not suggest that it just sort of organically spring as opposed to doing some real thought about who is best equipped to be on the trips, to have the phone calls, to make the engagements, as opposed to who is managing the interagency process and things like that. And it actually matters less who that is, I think, then they decide that, so that there's not confusion where different agencies are seen as speaking out of sort of different sides of the administration's mouth and things like that. The other thing is that it remains to be seen how much economic policy and trade policy in particular is seen as Asia policy, and how much of it is an extension of our domestic trade politics. So, already the Biden administration has renewed the aluminum tariff on the United Arab Emirates under the national security rationale, which is it was weak when Trump made it, it's still weak. And the Asia team, without, obviously speaking for them, I would bet would favor some way of demonstrating economic leadership, American economic leadership in Asia. That may or may not be linked to what USTR and the trade-minded officials have. And we saw in the Trump administration, where you had sort of Asia policy made on one side, and then trade policy made almost completely divorced from the military and the diplomatic and the other efforts. And I think that's I don't think it will be as severe under any circumstance that the Biden administration was in Trump, but that's something that they're going to need to figure out.
Yeah, I have a piece coming out on this afternoon. But anyways, Richard, I'm curious, like putting on your normative hat, like what do you think the right answer is?
Well, I mean, on the trade side, I mean, if I had my druthers, which obviously I don't, but if I had my druthers, we would not have gotten out of TPP. And now that we are out of it, we'd get back in. I mean, there's two regional multilateral trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, RCEP and TPP, and the United States is party to neither. That has both bad sort of micro effects where American exporters face higher barriers, higher tariffs, higher quotas than we would if we were party to those agreements. And it also has macro effects in the way the United States is perceived, in the sort of leverage and influence we have in the region, and the notion that the region is moving on without the United States and in some instances with China. So I think we should get back into the TPP. But it gets exactly to my point of, who would make that decision? Is it the Asia policymakers, or is it those who are subject to the domestic politics of trade? And my suspicion is that it will be the latter, if only because in the first term of most presidencies, that's the case.
Well, it's interesting also that, we have Susan Rice, who ended up at the head of the DPC. So, clearly she has some. She worked on this for a long time. It's not like this trade-off is foreign to her. But yeah, I mean, most politics is local. So we'll definitely follow that to see how those sort of tensions end up shaking out.
Yeah, and you're right. All the politics of this are local, and we're not in a particularly aggressively free trade moment in our politics in either party now, and so there's a bunch of considerations that have to be taken into account. But in the last year of the Obama administration, it was Vice President Biden who was sort of touting TPP, and I think he was right.
Where do you think the GOP is going to be on China in the next few years?
It's really become a more skeptical view of China. I think there had been a bigger split before, a few years ago, between those who believed, or at least hoped, that the kind of engage but hedge policy that characterized the Bush administration and large parts of the Obama administration, that deep engagement economically in terms of information flows, everything else, diplomatically, even militarily to some degree, would at a minimum help to make China a somewhat responsible stakeholder in the existing international system, may promote domestic liberalization, maybe even one day democratization. And that's out the window. I think it's out the window in the mainstream of both parties. And actually, I see, quite a convergence in the mainstream of both parties, Democratic and Republican, about skepticism about China and its intentions, and the sense that the United States needs to be far more competitive and, frankly, just tougher than it was in the Obama administration or in the Bush administration. The real question on the table, I think, for Republicans, but also to some degree for Democrats, is even if you liked the Trump administration's far more skeptical, tougher approach to China, beyond that level of abstraction, whether policy approach is the right ones. And I think the answer is it was in some and it wasn't in others. And that's really where the debate is going to be on, stuff like trade, how we configure our military, what we do on sort of the domestic innovation agenda, foreign aid, all of these kinds of things, all these sort of vectors of competition are going to be, that's what's going to be an issue. I don't see a lot of real debate about the sort of philosophical underpinnings of how to assess China right now.
Yeah. Speaking on the domestic innovation front, one of the things that has sort of, I guess, blew my mind over the past 2 years is watching more and more senators and representatives from the GOP side of the House grow more comfortable with spending real money to support domestic industry. Yeah. Do you think that's going to stick? Should it? how we're only a few weeks into the Biden administration, but there is certainly a line of thinking out there that says they are not interested in spending this sort of real tens, hundreds of billions of dollars on these sorts of issues when you have another party in power.
Yeah, I do think it's going to stick. I think it's slightly more complicated than sometimes it's made out to be, where people say, well, there are a lot of Republicans who've embraced an industrial policy now, and that's sort of been verboten philosophically in the party for a long time. At least when I hear folks like, Senator Rubio and others talk, when they say the words industrial policy, they don't really mean industrial policy the way economists grew up to think about industrial policy. Economic competition with the Japanese in the 1980s, where MITI was pouring money into key industries that were then going to sort of seize the commanding heights and be more economically competitive. And should the United States do it, or is a free market allocation of capital, does that actually suffice, or if not better, in terms of having the government pick industrial winners and losers? That's not really what people are talking about. What they're really talking about is government intervention in the private sector on national security grounds. The idea that, we need investment in R&D, or we need protection of certain industries on national security grounds. And I worry a little bit about, the idea that, everyone now suddenly wants industrial policy. If you take that on its sort of traditionally defined terms, and that would mean that the sort of standard way we've thought about capital allocation in the United States and the market's efficiency in doing it is all wrong. And even if there's not a market failure, you should be doing it anyway. And if you say that, then you're kind of open to spending endless amounts of money. One thing that I think we shouldn't do when we're responding to China is try to out-China China. I mean, we have a different system, and it can't be that just because they have one belt, one road, we need our own one belt, one road. They have their industrial policy, we need our own industrial policy. They spend lots of money trying to conquer key technologies, so we should have our own list of key technologies and spend our own lots of money kind of trying to conquer those. There are areas where that answer may make some sense, but we can't just be reactive and say we're gonna just pour money into these things. That said, I think the appetite to pour money again, on national security grounds, is quite high. It was almost a joke 15 or 20 years ago that, you could, inside government, anyone could get something funded if they sort of classified it as the war on terror. And then at the State Department, and, it was, well, you can get anything done as long as you classify it as part of the freedom agenda. And then it was, at the Defense Department, well, if you classify something as great power competition, you can, get funding for it. And now it's kind of like, well, if you can classify something as fitting into the need to respond to Chinese competition, then you can acquire funding for it. And I think, that's not all bad, of course. There's good reasons for that. But like anything else, we can take that a little too far.
Yeah. It's interesting thinking about all of those other moments and how they passed eventually.
So that's the thing. And I believe that the number one long-term challenge for the United States is competition with China, but it's not our only challenge. And Americans in the foreign policy, national security world have this habit of deciding almost on a dime that everything they thought was totally wrong and wasted, and that they have to make an all-out sort of assault on the new problem, right? So after 9/11, it was, oh my God, we took a holiday from history. We didn't pay attention to terrorism. We were paying attention to minor items like, China and Russia. It's about a global war on terrorism, a global counterinsurgency. We have to understand every branch of Boko Haram, everything else, right? And again, it's not that was totally untrue. We had a gigantic terrorism problem on our hand. It just wasn't the only problem. And now we have woken up in the last few years. We said, oh my God, we wasted all of our blood and treasure in the sands of the Middle East for nothing. We overreacted to terrorism. It's not that big of a deal. More people die in their bathtubs than in terrorist attacks. We should have been focused on Russia and China the whole time. And so now we've got to pivot everything and focus on that. Well, that doesn't make the Middle East unimportant either. So we're often not good at balance. But balance is all important, and it's going to be particularly important when we got a raging pandemic and the economic consequences, both on the fiscal and on the macroeconomic side, to deal with at home.
we were talking before I turned them. I pressed record about, back in the Danzig episode a few weeks ago, he had a little riff on, China thinks in decades and centuries, and I don't completely buy into that, but it's also clear that watching the U.S. arc over the past 20 years, we've certainly been a lot of big swings on where the attention is, and to expect that the sort of CNAS frame of starting back in 2010, 2011, that China is going to be the real issue, to stick with the American people is going to be, is not necessarily a given. And as you have written earlier, if she was, weighed not having the U.S. focus on it too much higher, they could potentially take different decisions on how to engage with the world in a way in which then you see Congress deciding, oh, this isn't that important, let's go spend the money somewhere else.
Right. And again, it gets back to seeing, the United States is not a regional power. I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. We're a global power with global interests and global concerns about what happens in different parts of the world. And that implies balancing your attention, your resources, your efforts, things like that. But we tend to get very possessed by one big idea and one big sort of galvanizing thing that disproportionately absorbs our time and attention and resources. So I think simultaneously that China is the number one challenge over the long run facing the United States, and that we shouldn't just pick up and remove all of our troops from Afghanistan, come what may, so that we can pay more attention to China, or whatever your sort of trade-off of choice might be. There are trade-offs to be made, but it is not the case that they're easy to make. That's sort of one for one. You focus on China or you focus on everything else in the world, and so the answer is obvious: is that obtains.
How do Chinese businesses operate outside of China? How do multinationals operate inside China? Who are China's leading entrepreneurs and startups, and how have they succeeded or failed? The Wire China, from Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times Shanghai correspondent David Barboza, is an online magazine focused on understanding China's economic rise. I've personally been impressed by their cover story pieces, which feature some of the deepest English language dives into China-related business topics. China Talk listeners can enter the code ChinaTalk21 for 25% off subscriptions at thewirechina.com/subscriptions.
What year were you in Japan?
1997 and 98. I had just graduated from college.
Okay, so way after the boom years. You weren't like seeing Reagan from the other side.
Yeah, no, it was definitely after the boom years. But I remember being very struck because when I went to Japan in 1997, I had never been to Japan before in my life. I'd never been to Asia in my life. And the reverberations from the change from the boom years to the lost decade were really settling in. And so people would describe themselves as, having gone through economic hard times or, and all stuff. But I looked around and the buildings were glittering and people had their Louis Vuitton bags and were driving, a Lexus and things like that. And I kind of thought, if this is what a recession or flat growth looks like, there's a lot of states in the United States that would sign up for this pretty quickly. So, it depends on where your base is, right? Yeah. When you have no growth, that turns out to matter a lot. So some of this was in the eye of the beholder.
Well, I think the answer is that it actually doesn't, right? Because the sort of delta is what people focus on as opposed to.
Well, right, yeah. So yeah, you're totally right. So emotionally and psychologically and politically, yes, but materially, coming, as sort of the alien from America dropped to sort of make a dispassionate kind of look at what really is there.
Yeah,
it's hard. It was hard to look around at Japan, and compared really with any other country in Asia at the time and anything else, and say, oh, it's Japan that's the one that's economically ailing.
Yeah. No, it's. I'm going to say this. Thinking about the China context, right? Like, there's been such positive momentum for so long now, and only only in like the past few years have we started to get the, postmodern like ennui of young people being like, oh, what does my life really mean? Like I work so long, I get really well paid, but like this is not satisfying, right? I mean, it was just last night and this morning I was in these Clubhouse rooms, which are unbelievable to listen to because it's like Clubhouse isn't banned yet in China, so you have sort of mainlanders and Hong Kongers and Taiwanese all just sort of like talking about their lives and their governments and their political systems and what have you. And clearly, it's like a very tight sample size of like people who have iPhones and like have had someone from abroad tell them what Clubhouse is. But hearing folks sort of gripe about like the postmodern-y things that you probably heard in Japan in 1997 in the Chinese context has been fascinating in the past, just in the past 24 hours.
And do you think that is just a stage of economic development, or is got some driver outside of where the individuals in question sort of find their material existence and therefore have almost kind of the luxury to reflect more deeply about what the hell does this all mean, and do I have purpose in the world, and all this other kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer, right? It's a little bit of both, and I think the most important thing to start off is like China contains multitudes. I'm having Scott Rosell and Natalie Hell on to talk about the book Invisible China, which is a sort of like brief 250-page portrait of the China which is not depressed that Pinduoduo is working them too hard. I think there is something to be said of the sort of depoliticization of society, which the CCP engaged in post 1989, really, of just having politics not be something that people are aware of, care about, have sort of any investment in. And that I did a show on this morning, which will probably air maybe a week or two after ours does. Yuran Zhang, Zhang Yuran, who's a PhD at Berkeley, was talking about how that sort of opened the window for Bo Xilai, which then who pushed this sort of like Maoist patriotism, like look at us, we're the true populist, which she saw as a kind of gap in the social headspace of China, and has tried to fill it with his all making China great again, like we're a big country, like we should all be proud, we're going to have these super awesome military parades and push all this positive energy about the future of China into all our TVs and movies and video games and what have you. So that was not a clear answer to the question you asked, but I think it just goes to show how I don't have a sum up sentence, but it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer to it either, but it is, it's interesting to think about whether when, people in China or anywhere else move through stages of economic development that get them from, essentially struggling to get through the day to not. And then, does that sort of open up this search for meaning, which animates, all humans at some level? And then if there are traditional answers to that search for meaning, like engagement in politics, religion, things like that are not available or just not terribly are not available as sort of outlets for that, then what fills in that gap? What are people looking for? What do they aspire to? What are they attracted to? And is what they ultimately are attracted to something that can be provided by the government in terms of ideology and nationalism and a sense of history and things like that? And my guess is for some people it can, and for some people it can't.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't have a conclusive answer on that either, but it is a really interesting question.
Yeah. And then you sort of go back to the like, to what extent is this universal, right? Versus like whatever meaning means to you is very different in a 21st century Chinese cultural context than it would have been, to some college educated Americans circa 1776. So it's very difficult to sort of get into that headspace, and because people don't have answers to these sorts of questions, right?
Yeah. Well, and and of course, it's impossible to abstract from a giant population or even a small population with the answer. But I mean, one thing that struck me before I went to Japan all those years ago was there was a sense in the United States among those who were sort of writing here and there on Japan and things like that, that because of Japanese economic development, the availability of luxury goods, the sort of lack of religion in a lot of areas, the sort of depoliticization of a lot of things, the sort of the lack of a kind of a big foreign policy. Even history was contested, and so that it become an utterly materialistic society. And then people would drop down in Tokyo, and they would see skyscrapers and lights everywhere and products available from all over the world and everything, and it sort of all fit into this nice thing to say, well, the Japanese people who once had all these sort of cultural qualities or historical qualities or martial qualities now are just materialists. And the thing that I saw just anecdotally and on a very, very micro level in the little town I lived in was, of course people liked stuff, but they were engaged in all kinds of community activities and cultural activities and all these other kind of things that gave their lives meaning, wholly apart from what the latest outfit or car was or something like that. So anyway, I know we're getting a little off on a tangent, but anyway.
No, I think it's totally true. And bringing us back to the present day, like all those questions, I think get pushed off 5-10 years when you've seen your government deliver in keeping you having a normal life for the course of 2020, and the rest of the world, save Taiwan, basically, has not had that luxury.
Yeah. New Zealand too.
Yeah, New Zealand. Yeah, shout out to New Zealand. How should Biden fit Xinjiang into his posture towards China?
Well, to step back from that for a second, the human rights situation, which obviously includes but is not limited to what's going on in Xinjiang, appears like it's going to be a higher priority for the Biden administration than it was for the Trump administration. That said, it's one of many issues that we have in the bilateral relationship with China, to state the obvious. So you could list off 10 off the top of your head if you want to talk about South China Sea and illiberal technology and interference abroad and Taiwan, and you can go on A2AD capabilities that could push the U.S. military back from the mainland. You could go around and around and around. We've got a lot of issues, and so the question is, in my mind, is it absolutely more important to the Biden administration than it was to the Trump administration, which I think, and no doubt it was, at least to the president, where, supposedly President Trump, according to John Bolton, when Xi Jinping mentioned Xinjiang, Trump sort of said, good on you for those concentration camps. Okay, let's not do that for starters. But the question is, where does it stand relative to these other issues? Because in the kind of bilateral diplomacy between the United States and China, I mean, like many countries, I think Chinese interlocutors will listen very intently to what the number one issue is on the bilateral agenda. They may not do a lot about it, but they will certainly take it seriously, and they may do something about it. They'll listen less to number two. By number three, they see that it's not really a priority for us. And by four, you've lost your audience, and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10. So what really are the top issues, or the top, 1 or 2 or 3? And so I think, with Xinjiang, the administration's likely to put sanctions in place. They obviously sort of reinforced the Trump administration's labeling it of genocide. They'll try to publicize, I think, what's going on there and things like that. The overarching question that I have, which is it's really a question, is the administration, this administration wants things that the Trump administration didn't, right? So Trump administration was basically unencumbered by seeking Chinese cooperation on anything except North Korea there for a couple of years, because the president said that there's no such thing as climate change. It was cold the other day. We don't have to worry about it. So didn't need cooperation on climate change, didn't want cooperation on pandemic, wouldn't have gotten it even if they did. And there wasn't a lot else there. This administration is going to come in and have climate at the very top of the global priority list. So if you get to, you want to be tough on China on things like Xinjiang, but you want to potentially cooperate with them on things like climate, the administration, I think, will say, well, we'll try to do both at the same time. It's not clear to me that's possible.
Yeah.
And if push comes to shove, which one gives? Do we soften up on the stuff we have as beefs between the two countries? Or do we lower expectations for what's possible on the cooperative side, because it's more important for us to be firm and to be competitive in other areas? And I think they're going to end up having to answer that question sooner rather than later, because at a minimum, I think the Chinese are going to try to link these issues all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting coming back to personnel. John Kerry is not someone who does not care about human rights. Right. And,
right, exactly.
You know, he was very explicit in his first comments about this, that, you know, I have no intention of not talking about Chinese human rights problems just because we're also asking them to shut down some coal plants.
Obviously, we have limited leverage with a powerful country like China. So the question is, where do you want to direct the effort of that leverage? Right. So if you have leverage, do you and you can't have everything. So do you want to use it on human rights? Do you want to use it on Taiwan? Do you want to use it? I mean, part of this is also you have to attach probabilities you're actually going to be able to accomplish something, right? Because you could use leverage against something the Chinese are unwilling to change on no matter what, and then you haven't really accomplished anything specifically there. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, John Kerry, you know, I'm sure, like many people in the administration, would like to see cooperation with China on climate and would like to be firm opposing what China's doing with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong and in other things like that. Can you do both those things at the same time? It just is going to remain to be seen. It's not clear to me also that cooperation is really what we need in some of these areas, as opposed to parallel efforts. So I could see a world in which climate is much more important to this administration. They're doing much more than their predecessor, and that the Chinese are doing something on climate, but it's not cooperation in the sense that we would have to give something up and they would do something, they'd give something up and we would do something, and we sort of work together. But
yeah,
again,
that's my take too, Richard. Like, Xi is not doing climate change because he thinks that it, you know, is going to win him plaudits in democratic circles in the U.S., right? You know, there are environmental protection regions. He's worried about climate. His government is thinks climate change is real and is worried about it. And you know, maybe there are sort of like things, you know, 5-10% on the margin, which U.S.-China quote unquote cooperation would help further that. But I don't necessarily see him turning into a climate change denier or weighing the importance of attacking pollution any less domestically just because you know, America is leaning on him in one policy area or another.
Right. Or even that the mechanisms by which those things happen have to be cooperative per se. So, I mean, what do we want on climate when it comes to China? Lower emissions. China can lower its emissions without cooperating with the United States.
Yeah.
Right. We can lower our emissions without cooperating with China or anybody else. So there's both what you're describing, and then there's also just the mechanics of this. There are things that so, you know, this in some ways, I think, is a big overarching question for the administration. They're about to start testing this hypothesis that, you know, some cooperation can be accomplished even while we're very competitive and outright hostile in other areas. And we'll see whether that's true.
Do you have thoughts on the Olympics?
I don't think the United States should boycott the Olympics.
Okay.
I mean, I don't remember the 1980 Olympics because I was only 5 years old. But we tried this boycotting the Olympics business before, and it didn't seem to accomplish anything.
Well, it's interesting because I just read a book about it, and I keep previewing other China Talk episodes that are come out. It was extraordinarily popular, both in the U.S. and in Europe beforehand. It was polling at like 80%, folks being okay boycotting. And then Lake Placid happened, and people were like, oh, wow, it's actually really fun to beat the Russians. So why don't we so then that number dropped down to like 45%. And it was a huge mess because it's not the governments that decide, it's the Olympic committees themselves. So like the governments, they had to like lean on the Olympic committees, or even in some cases, like just not issue visas for the athletes to go to these places. So, you know, I mean, I think sort of the more impactful thing would be athletes like saying things or you know, like making a big show of it. And the unfortunate thing is like the Winter Olympics don't have a lot of Muslims, right? So the chance of that materializing is much lower than it would have been if it was a Summer Games. But anyways,
Yeah, and the other problem we had in 1980 is that like the Brits didn't boycott. So like some of our friends, a lot of our friends did in solidarity, but some didn't. And anyway, it just didn't seem to achieve anything. I had not totally realized the sequencing of people being excited after Lake Placid, but that makes all the sense of the world if they thought that we could see I don't know, Rocky beating Ivan Drago over and over again in whatever the sport was. But what you bring up though is I think actually it goes well beyond the Olympics when you're talking about what's happening in Xinjiang, and I think it's really important that every majority Muslim country in the world for certain, but every country understand really what is happening in Xinjiang, and that does not get swept under the rug or undue attention or anything else, because it is very appallingly serious, and it's the kind of thing that I think the United States, both on interest and values grounds, should have a role in making sure that people know what's going on.
What's the biggest disagreement you had with Ely on China policy when you guys were working together?
The biggest, I think probably the biggest disagreement that we had was not on China policy kind of in a vacuum, but what that implied for other policy issues. I think Ely, without putting words in his mouth, but what the hell? He's in government and he can't talk, and I'm here on the podcast, so why not? He favors a very, very kind of laser-like focus on the China challenge, the Indo-Pacific as a region, and sees the trade-offs that an approach like that would otherwise imply with America's presence and activities in the greater Middle East and in Europe and things like that. And I favor not getting out of Afghanistan all of a sudden and leaving it to the Taliban to take over and becoming a terrorist sanctuary, and not immediately withdrawing from Iraq and Syria and watching ISIS reformulate, and keeping troops in Europe and as a deterrent against Russian misbehavior and things like that. So it's probably a matter of emphasis if you look at the big picture.
And to be clear, Richard, I tried to get him on for 3 years, so it's not like he didn't have his chance.
What was wrong with him? He should have been on this thing. Oh, man, you should have mentioned that to me. I would have tried to persuade him, but, I didn't persuade him of any of these other things, so I probably would have been unsuccessful.
So you and a handful of other Silicon Valley luminaries wrote a 30-page take on, what the U.S. should do with a particular focus on sort of technology challenges to, rise to the China threat. I'm curious, what is it like working through these questions with folks from Silicon Valley? And, what did you learn from them? And, what do you think were their blind spots in confronting this set of issues?
Well, we met on a weekly basis virtually, of course, and I found it totally fascinating because there was kind of a handful of policy folks, and then there was the other handful of people that were from the business and the tech world, most of whom had not worked in government, and those of us on the policy side hadn't spent years out in Silicon Valley, but we're tackling the same question. And the starting points for tackling these questions tended to be very different. There's a problem, right? So the problem is, fill in the blank. China wants Huawei to build out 5G networks all over the place, or China selling facial recognition systems to dictatorships, which are going to use those to further repress their own people. Pick whatever the thing is you want. And the starting point tends to be very different. So, we policy people will say, okay, well, government could do something. And certainly there's so this is about diplomacy and regulation and export controls. And certainly there's a private sector role. So government can convene the private sector and provide incentive to blah, 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 blah. And the folks often from outside would say, hey, here's what a company could do about that. Not even here's what a company could do in terms of the market, but here's what a company could do technologically. There may be a technological solution to this. So for another example is, while we're going through all this, there was all of the talk about TikTok, right? and the Trump administration is going to ban TikTok and things like that. So the first question is, what is it that we're actually worried about with TikTok? Is it we're worried about the privacy of user information that would be exposed over TikTok as an app? Is it the propagandizing of our children through ads and the classification of content or something like that? And so we in the sort of policy world kind of said, well, it comes down to whether the government should ban TikTok or not. And those on the technological side sort of started with, well, what is it? Where is it you want to go to? And then are there technological solutions that could push in one direction or the other, right? Like if you're worried about propaganda, there may be a technical solution to that. If you're worried about privacy, there could be a technical solution to that. If you're worried about whatever else you're worried about, there may be a technical solution or a market solution to that. And it was really fascinating to me. And in my experience, we tend to look at both those sets of possible solutions almost in isolation. You either do one or you do the other, and there's not a lot that you sort of say, well, hey, if we really wanted to address this, we might combine these efforts. And so to me, that was kind of really valuable in those discussions, was to see how other people have approached these same problems.
What other professional circles that aren't all that involved in the making of foreign policy today would you also be interested in doing this exercise with?
I think there's one on climate that I have really not been as involved in as I would like to, but I think there's discussions to be had that are similar between those who are looking not just at some of the issues like, what is the international framework for, Paris or something else, or, the UN framework or something, but, what is sort of the cutting edge of climate technology? What is the array of adaptation and mitigation approaches? What are the economic costs, and how would one think about the economics of these things? There's a lot of talk about climate change as a national security matter, which tends to be either really operational, like how much gas should a tank use and can it use less, or where do you relocate naval installations that are going to be subject to higher sea levels in the future, or really broad, that climate change is going to cause resource wars and desertification and have dislocating, where's the population of Bangladesh going to go if you have rising sea levels and things like that. It's everything in the middle that is actually where people are doing a lot of work, but not as much on the national security and sort of foreign policy side as on the scientific, economic, legal side. And so to me, that would be an area I think that could be really fruitful. I don't know. Is there one that you would say? I mean, some of the other ones I've thought about in the past, actually. I mean, I guess it feels less kind of apposite now, but I've thought in the past that religion would actually be an interesting set of discussions, just because so many of the foreign policy makers are either quite secular sort of elites, or maybe they know their own faith, well enough, but don't really factor into the array of forces shaping the behavior of friends and adversaries around the world, the religious motivation, and should we have a deeper understanding of that as national security and foreign policy makers? But I'm sure there are others as well beyond the technology and the climate. And I don't know, what would you nominate?
No, that's a really interesting one. And I spent 2020 reading 2,000 pages of Martin Luther King biography and watching him and Reinhold Niebuhr and Heschel be very active, not just on civil rights stuff, but also on Vietnam, of course. There is stuff to be learned from that community, to be sure.
But there, I mean, on this particular point, it's really interesting to me that when we're searching for explanations of our own foreign policy behavior or that abroad, we very often tend to credit a whole variety of different explanations except religion, even when religion seems explicitly present. So there's kind of what you were describing, the role the Reinhold Niebers and Martin Luther Kings, not only on specific policy issues like should we be in or out of Vietnam, but also on helping to develop this almost messianic sense that we have that the United States is an exceptional nation, that we have sort of a responsibility to help in place universal values and things like that, and that has a religious kind of, I think, some religious origin and things. But then also, I remember the last round of protests in Iran and reading a bunch of articles about why did these happen? Because people are on the roofs and some of them are shouting Allahu Akbar, right? And the explanations were, well, the economy's taken a big hit and the currency has been devalued and, jobs are really, so people are angry because of that, or, students don't, there's basic freedom. I mean, there was an economic explanation, kind of a social explanation, there was political explanations, but were often religious explanations, even when a lot of the activity was taking place in religious venues and had a religious character to the language they were using. Yeah. So it's clearly not all religious, but it's probably wrong to say it's not religious at all. And I just think that's a little bit of a, Madeleine Albright wrote a book years ago called The Mighty and the Almighty, who was sort of making the point that religion was, as a force, was sort of insufficiently factored into our understandings. And I think since then, with the war on terror and things like that, we've made some strides, but really only as it comes to religious extremism, as opposed to just people going about their daily lives. So anyway, it's another tangent, but
no. Yeah. I think it it ties back to our conversation earlier about like what's making Chinese people tick nowadays, right? And
yeah,
exactly. there's no we're not going to arrive at an answer and 3 bullet points of like what bills we should pass because we have that answer, right? But I think having those questions front and center is important to trying to figure out what the right thing the U.S. should be doing in the world is.
And the one thing I would just say on the technology side is I think we're getting better on this, but there still is this, and part of this is generational probably too, but there still tends to be this sense among policymakers that the technology people really understand this stuff and they can give us the answer we're looking for. So we'll ask the question and we will elicit from them the answer without really understanding what's at issue. And it's almost sometimes like I saw in government with lawyers, right? We have a question, we'll ask the lawyers will sort of scroll away, come up with the answer, and then we've got the answer. We don't actually have to necessarily understand the legal argument itself or why that's the argument, whether that's right or wrong and things like that, because that's what lawyers do. And technology is just doesn't work that way. I think the equivalent would be, if in 1973 Henry Kissinger walked into the Situation Room and they were talking about whether they should raise the DEFCON level during the Yom Kippur War. And Kissinger said, well, I don't really understand how a nuclear weapon works. I mean, let's just go ask the engineers who build those, and they can probably tell you, I mean, it's just, there's a baseline level of technological fluency that is going to have to be part of the intellectual toolkit that every national security policymaker brings to bear. It doesn't mean anybody has to be a software engineer or anything like that, but you have to have a basic level. And without it, I just don't think that people are going to be as effective as they need to be.
Going back to 2008, let's say we live in a world in which we get 8 years of McCain as opposed to Obama. Assuming, she still comes to power, like, do you have any, do you want to play the game of like, to what extent you think the U.S.-China dynamic would have been different coming out of that?
That's a great question. I've never thought about that. So 8 years of John McCain instead of 8 years of Barack Obama, and
then start the clock at 2016. Let's not do the branching futures with Trump or whatever.
Yeah, it's hard to say, and the reason I think it's hard to say, I guess I fundamentally think that the relationship after 8 years would not have been very different. It probably would have been different in some ways. I mean, John McCain was more skeptical about Chinese intentions and activities and was much more focused on some of the human rights issues and the lack of democracy and things like that than I think Obama was. So I think the content of some of the policies and steps would have been different. But to me, part of the story of Chinese behavior, at least under Xi Jinping, is how little it's changed in response to American policy.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I think policy should more often be, as I think it is now, directed to responding to Chinese behavior and Chinese leaders that have agency to make their own decisions, rather than imagining Chinese decisions as somehow be a dependent variable that is a function of whether the United States is friendly or coercive or shows respect or not, or thinks they're a responsible stakeholder, thinks they'll never be. So I think it might be different here and there, but not fundamentally different.
So let's say you weren't running a think tank and had 3 years to go in a cabin and write a book.
The whole reason why people go to think tanks often is so they can write a book. I seem to have not been able to put all that together, but the idea is that you don't need a cabin for 3 years. But in fact, as you're alluding to, it really may be the case that one does. So if I was going to write a book, I guess there would be one is, would I be if I'm writing on the kind of stuff that animates me on a daily basis, it would be essentially focused on what I think is sort of the world to come, where the United States is, its raw power is increasing, its relative power vis-a-vis China is decreasing, but that's by not at any means the full measure of the story. But that implies a whole variety of disruptions to the way international life has been. And then to be able to spell out what that means, reflecting on, I think there's been large parts of our foreign policy that over the past 30 years have been very unsuccessful. And because of what we were talking about kind of at the very beginning, we tend to put the hard stuff behind us and sort of click forward to the next big challenge and go at it with abandonment, or go at it with sometimes abandonment. And in the end, it's a sustainable balance in our foreign policy that we need. So I'm describing this in the abstract, which is probably why I haven't written the book. But I see a lack of sustainability that has characterized our foreign policy, that has sort of lurched with greater and lesser degrees of success from one big thing to the other over the past 30 years. And I would love to see us get out of that cycle and be able to see ourselves as the leading global power, but a very kind of different kind of power when we interpret what that means for us. Then if I had to have a totally separate book, which, would have very little to do with what animates me on a daily basis, I would write about the lessons of fiction for the challenges of today and tomorrow. I wrote a little fun piece, I don't know, 2 years ago. No, oh my God, it's hard to think. It was during the pandemic. Time passes fast. And it was called To Prepare for Crisis, Read Fiction. And I tried to kind of pull out some of the reflections and lessons of various novels for how one should think about this sort of global cataclysm that we are in. And that would be fun.
All right,
I would read it.
What are the books?
I think there are lessons from there's lessons from some of the great Russian novels like War and Peace and Anna Karenina and the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and stuff. One's for how one kind of internalizes problems and dilemmas and things from some of the more recent stuff like Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. And actually, I just read a fascinating novel over the weekend, which I had never read before. It's back from the 1960s. The Woman of the Dunes by Kobo Abe. It's a quick read. It's only 200 pages. He was a prominent kind of new wave Japanese novelist in the 60s and the 70s and so forth, and gets really inside the head. He sort of reframes Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus into this Japanese setting, and tries to ask, as many people were in the 1960s, what is this all about? What is the meaning of existence? Can you actually choose one's disposition given your external conditions? Can you choose to be happy? Is it all in your mind? How much of this? And a bunch more where that came from. So I could
you're just taking cues from Richard Danzig, aren't you?
What's that?
You got that? Did you get that? You got that?
Yeah,
right?
Actually, I've totally forgot. I totally forgot that's where I got it. So yeah, I totally forgot. So I got it from you and Richard Danzig because he mentioned this. And so I said I had read, he mentioned The Lonely Polygamist by Brady Udall, which I've read, and another book which I haven't. And so, I've read a decent amount of Japanese novels, but I hadn't read the one that he mentioned. So that's why I read it. Yeah. So this all comes back to this podcast. At the end of the day, I totally forgot about that.
I was going to say, Richard, I was about to make fun of you for picking like super basic books like, Tolstoy. And then all of a sudden you hit me with the super niche Japan 200-word novel. And then I realized, in fact, no, you actually just got it from Danzig. So anyways, hopefully you two get to write that book together one day. I think that'd be a fun little collaboration. There's one last one. I really should end it here, but someone told me to ask you this, and I don't want to let him down. What do you think the U.S. can reasonably expect on multilateral cooperation on things like export controls from its allies, and just maybe taking that particular example and more broadly on like how much we should expect and what the U.S. should do to help shore up allies who, understandably are a little scared to stand up to China on their own?
I'll answer that in a second, but just to think of a couple of things. If people are wondering, like what to read, given that they've got some time in the pandemic, they're trying to make sense of the world. There's a great Icelandic masterpiece called Independent People. And it is basically about this broken farmer who walks through the countryside with his daughter and all of these things. And the question on the table is sort of, what do you do when you can't do much, but people are suffering around you? And of course, there's like The Plague by Albert Camus and some of these other things. And then if people haven't read Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, and this sort of story about how you live through political upheaval in India, but political upheaval, that's totally worth it too. So anyway, and if you haven't checked out Haruki Murakami, then you either like it or you don't. But anyway, all right. So export controls, equally fascinating, right?
I feel bad. I shouldn't have done that.
Export controls, moving right from, the Three Body Trilogy and Neuromancer and the Foundation to export controls. That's what we want. So export controls, I don't know. It's hard to say because if the Huawei, I know Huawei was not export controls per se, but if that was sort of the test case of how the democratic countries of the world get together and decide whether or not a particular piece of Chinese technology is verboten and therefore should be excluded from their economies, that was a mess and a half. The Australians came out first and thought that at least the Five Eyes were going to click behind them. Trump left it saying, well, maybe we'll trade it away for greater soybean purchases or something. And then, of course, excluded it. The Brits said, well, Huawei could build out the periphery of the network. And then they flipped and said, no, the core. And, the U.S. was threatening countries by saying, if you don't exclude Huawei, then you will lose your access to our intelligence. And then countries said, yeah, we don't believe that. and so they demarched them on other grounds and things like that. And over time, I think they've kind of wobbled. Everybody's wobbled away to something, basically saying, well, it's generally not a good idea for Huawei to build up the 5G network in a country, but maybe it's okay if they, sell handholds in our country and things like that. The only reason I go through that is because I think this is hard when you get to the specifics. And it's hard because there's competition between our countries, even though they're democratic and have very similar values and may have very similar concerns. And we are asymmetrically worried about, or kind of differently worried about Chinese punitive action. So if the United States is going to slap export controls on something that's important to China, I don't know, or do something to ZTE and put ZTE on the entity list or whatever, then the sort of risk calculation associated with that for the United States would be very different than Austria, right? Even though we're both democratic countries. So that's a long way of saying I think that we have to work as carefully as we can to try to harmonize the approach to export controls across lines, at least of the big democratic economies. But I think that in the specifics, it's going to be quite challenging sometimes to actually get everybody on the same page.
What do you think of, the NATO for trade, or some sort of fund to help for the U.S. to kind of help its allies kind of eat the potential costs that would potentially come from Chinese action? if they do step up and do some of these activities, which almost certainly would invite Beijing's response.
I think it's a good idea. And I think that could mitigate some of the worry about Chinese punitive measures and therefore embolden governments to take stands to protect either outflowing exports that they would otherwise sell to the Chinese or inflowing technology that they otherwise purchase from the Chinese. The question that I have at the end of the day is, how much do you actually have to put in a fund like that for it to really matter? And how much are governments going to be willing, the rich governments going to be willing to put into a fund like that post-pandemic when everybody's trying to get their economies back together? Hundreds of millions of dollars, great, but that's, okay, you start dividing that up among the different countries that, could easily go through an Australia kind of experience if they make a move that is perceived by the Chinese to be against their interests and need to be taught a lesson. So I think it's a good idea, but I don't think that on its own is going to be able to sort of turn the tide.
A last fun one. What is the book you don't necessarily want to write, but really want to read that hasn't been written yet?
The book that I don't want to write, but would like to read?
Or just that you aren't capable of or requires some language skills you don't have or something. Like what's the piece of analysis or book that hasn't been written yet that has a question you'd really like to see answered or addressed?
Well, I have an easy one to that, which is I would love to see a real no kidding explanation of what the Chinese leadership says to each other when they're making the decisions that matter to us. Because, it's like Kremlinology, right? You're looking for bits and pieces to be able to intuit what is motivating leaders, how much is sort of a hidden motivation versus one that's said, but maybe less than the whole thing. As some of the Cold War historians pointed out, one of the big surprises to some Cold War historians when the Kremlin finally opened its archives and you could see the transcripts of these Politburo meetings was they actually believed in what they were saying. They actually believed in Marxist-Leninism. They actually believed in communism. They actually believed in sort of global revolution. They actually believed they were under siege from the United States and the capitalist world and things like that. This wasn't sort of a wash so that they could, have their dachas and keep everybody and find, houses and all this other kind of stuff. It may have been that too, but they didn't talk to each other about it. It was really about this ideological motivation. And you, I'm sure, actually have a view on this. But what are the key drivers of Chinese decision making? And I just don't think that the book has been written, and probably the book that can be written on where they're all coming from and what this is really all about.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, thinking back to Red Star over China in 1937, because the U.S. sort of did get that, right, with Mao in the early years, but that wasn't necessarily for the best, right? Because what that book was able to do was convince FDR that this guy wasn't so bad, and kind of his lionization ended up making it a lot harder for Chiang Kai-shek to get to the support he needed to win the Civil War. And, thinking about why this book hasn't been written, there was Jeff Wasserstrom just wrote a piece on this, kind of interviewing all the journalists who could write this about why they're not. And, there isn't the source material out there,
right,
which is unfortunate. And, thinking back to when we really started to learn things about Mao, he had to die. And the society had to open up. And then you have, books like his personal doctor telling all these stories, and you had the sort of memoirs start to come out. But now the risk is just so great for anyone, even whispering to, Ling Ling from the Wall Street Journal about what happened in a meeting a week ago, much less doing a deep dive into Xi's psychology or what have you, that, it's just not possible. And, I'm sure there are people taking notes, and, 20 years from now, whenever he moves past the scene and the Chinese political universe changes, we'll learn a ton and it'll be fascinating. But I agree. That's the book I would love to read. And it's unfortunate that we don't have a better sense. And I don't necessarily think the intelligence community has a better sense either, because it's just something that is he has decided he has no interest in sort of engaging in a way that other past post-Mao CCP leaders have been open and excited to.
Well, and it's such amazing contrast to at least the past 4 years when our president's psychological profile was on hourly display for all to if you wanted to understand where he was coming down, he told you, right? And here we're we, as you're saying, we won't likely read that book until it's no longer relevant other than in a historical context.
I almost had a show with Michelle Flournoy, and I pulled out her graduate school thesis to prep, and it was on the psychosocial approach to international relations. Basically, sort of like writing about to what extent it's important to kind of understand people, individual leaders and, society's psychology when it comes to this sort of thing.
Well, just on that, I mean, beyond the individual psychological drivers of people, which of course is important, particularly in a place where you have a leader as strong as she is, a lot of times we tend to, assume motivations, particularly in our, adversaries, that may or not actually be the most important, right? So I think about this in a Russian context where, there's one set of explanations that says Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs, they're basically, it's a kleptocracy and they want their stuff and they want to stay in power. And so they know the way to do that is to have an external enemy against whom they can whip up the support from the public. And that kind of explains the constant meddling in democracies abroad or the push on NATO and the sort of framing of all this as a threat. And I actually think that's very wrong. I mean, I'm sure they like their stuff and want to stay in power, but I think there's a strong historical instinct that everybody, with the possible exceptions of Yeltsin and Gorbachev, had in both Russian and Soviet history that is shared by the Russian leadership, that genuinely feels under threat from the outside, even though that threat is not there, that NATO actually doesn't want to topple the government of Russia, but they worry about these kinds of things, and that sees a gap between the current way that Russia is seen in the world and the status that they believe Russia should be accorded, given what they believe is its power and historical weight, which is never going to be closed, because the way they think of that is not going to sort of come down to the level of what the actual power projection capabilities are, and they're never going to regrow themselves back into a big Soviet Union superpower. So when you have this sort of feeling like you're not getting the status and the recognition you deserve, and when you feel like you're constantly under siege and threat, even if that's not really there, then that explains a lot. But it's a very different way of understanding this than if you think these are a bunch of KGB guys who were always business people parading as spies and want to make money. So anyway.
That was one hell of a mansion, though.
I mean, that is one hell of a mansion.
Richard Fontaine, thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And next time we'll talk about mansions of the rich and famous.
这世界变得好像不太一样。这世界变，再大的新闻很快遗忘。这世界变，行尸走肉满街游荡。这世界变，无脑跟风冲上流量。这世界变，这世界变。这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变。I have a dream， 这世界没有眼泪，欢乐的全是免费。I gotta pay， 所有的伤痛我背，当作是成长体会。为情而为，哪一条都是 OK， 只要你坚持就对。You want be free， 选择了就别后退，没时间让你后悔。这世界变太快，我还没看明白，我感觉不太坏，跟不上千奇百怪。这世界变太快，我还没看明白，我感觉不太坏，跟不上千奇百怪。当我们将自己变成了卖惨，吹嘘的让他们带感，给他们快感，脑海被金钱和物质给塞满，感觉像是无坚不摧的泰山。音乐中充满了虚幻，可是我还是要面对这现实。如果对未来有美好的期盼，请问谁又想要当一个骗子？ 这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变。No way， 没人会对你说 OK， 这世界不会有优惠，但也别觉得是受罪。无数次后悔向后退，谁敢把你放在后背？他们的脸又红又黑，却仿佛不知道羞愧。对世界说了句讨厌，这样很少见，不得不表现，就当做考验。真不想听那一些浮华的理想，因为会觉得太假。到头来才发现，何必说太真的话，这样的做法太傻。这世界变得快，我还没看明白，我感觉不太坏，跟不上千奇百怪。这世界变得快，我还没看明白，我感觉不太坏，跟不上，跟不上。这世界变得好像不太一样，这世界变。再大的新闻很快遗忘，这世界变，行尸走肉满街游荡，这世界变，无脑跟风冲上流量，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变，这世界变。
虚幻，眼中迷雾驱散，不自在飞水一战，欲望在空中弥漫。不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说。一切皆为虚幻，眼中迷雾驱散，不自在飞水一战，欲望在空中弥漫。不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说。一花一世界，一叶一如来，原本无一物。何处惹尘埃？逐渐悟明白，善恶恨与爱被情绪所掩盖。I want， 置身事外，掉进了自身的 trouble 里，仿佛是漫威里的毒液占据了你身体，试图想控制你。突然失控，怀疑围攻我，因为我想挑战创世纪。人活在强大的统治力，再给我更多的爱你气，再给我更多的爱你气。当局会逐渐放肆，内心的日益壮大，抛弃了所谓框架。是一变得宽广，不光只见识赞赏，一切为无上之想。历史太重，是遇到阻碍，要早日破坏，你去开始对峙。凝视窗外，有别的童话，就放弃重来，也 that's me。期待我生活里 no lie， 为人生高的秀才，不生不灭，不过不见，不增不减。一切皆为虚幻，眼中迷雾驱散，不自在飞水一战，欲望在空中弥漫。不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说。一切皆为虚幻，眼中迷雾驱散，不自在飞水一战，欲望在空中弥漫。不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说，不可说。